In this presentation, we will be examining the question of what role exoticism plays within fantasy, and fantasy music in particular. Through J.R.R. Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, we will see the focus within fantasy on bringing the audience into a newly created world which lends itself to exoticism. Howard Shore's score for the film adaptation of the Lord of the Rings trilogy illustrates how this focus translates from literature to music, making fantasy music intrinsically exotic. What makes a composition fantasy music? Well, drawing from the highlighted portion of this quote by musicologist Isabella van Alperen, where she states that the fantasy soundtrack makes audible a fragment of that other world by traversing the time-space from then and there to now and here, we see that the fantasy soundtrack concerns itself largely with creating and then drawing the audience into a new time-space, which is this fantasy world. In order to do this, the fantasy soundtrack uses classical orchestral scoring with straightforward harmonies, but relies on contrasts to create that sense of something new and fantastic. These contrasts may be between sections of the orchestra, for example, between winds and strings. However, composers of fantasy music often produce this sense of the fantastic by embedding the orchestral idiom with sounds that reference musical traditions that lie outside the time-space that the Western Romantic music occupies. These references may be effected by using modes, extended techniques, or adding voices or other non-traditional instruments to the orchestral texture. This idea that the goal of all fantasy is to draw the audience into a newly created world is not unique to music, but it shows up in fantasy literature as well. In his essay on fairy stories, Tolkien writes that fairy stories are not necessarily about fairies, but they're stories concerning fairy, the realm or state in which fairies have their being. Because those who work within fantasy are, in fact, creating a whole new world, Tolkien called this an act of subcreation. As a Catholic, he believed all human beings are created in the image of God, and as such are designed to imitate their Maker's original creative work. Thus, humans are most creaturely and thus most human when through imagination they see new constellations, set up mountain ranges, and develop new strange species of beasts. All this is subcreation because mortals do not have the capacity to create ex nihilo, or out of nothing. Thus, eclecticism is a key feature in Tolkien's idea about creativity. He saw true human creativity as something that comes from the use of adjectives, which is skillfully recombining elements of the real, quote unquote real, or human world to create an alternative universe. What does this have to do with musical exoticism? To be clear, we first need to define our terms, and I'll be looking at definitions offered by musicologists Jonathan Bellman and Ralph P. Locke. Jonathan Bellman's definition emphasizes the idea of a borrowed, foreign-sounding stylistic element, which a composer may use to evoke a sense of otherness. Ralph P. Locke, on the other hand, believes this definition is too narrow, and he broadens it to include music that's designed to evoke a different place or time or way of being, whether the music is quote-unquote exotic sounding or not. Fantasy music fits both of these definitions. First, it does attempt to bring the audience into a different place, time, or way of being. Second of all, if Tolkien is correct, in the creative process of fantasy involves bringing together disparate elements of the primary world, we will expect that composers will, quote unquote, borrow many different musical elements from different times and places. We will now examine two themes from Howard Shore's The Lord of the Rings soundtrack and see how they function as exoticism, even though they are both drawn from the broader Western European musical tradition. The first theme that we are considering is the Lothlorien theme, and I would encourage you to listen to the sound examples I have linked in the description below. We hear in this theme that Howard Shore uses certain medieval topoi to evoke chant. We see these in the vocal technique used. It has a very pure sound with little to no vibrato. The tonality is rather ambiguous. The mode is quite similar to Phrygian. The phrases are long and intertwined, and the recording has quite a bit of reverb, as if it was performed in a large space like a church. While all of this seems to reference medieval church music, unlike Gregorian chant, this melody is based on a scale that contains an augmented interval between the second and third scale degrees, which is also reminiscent of the Arabic Makam Hijaz scale. This creates a sense of unease as the audience is not exactly sure where to place this theme, and this also plays into the storyline as the hobbits are uncertain whether the elves of Lothlorien are friends or foes. It's also unclear whether this is conveying a general sense of ancientness or whether it's intended to create a sense of holiness. Now, as we noted before, Rolf P. Locke introduces binaries as instruments of communicating exoticism. One of those is self versus other. And we know as a devout Catholic, Tolkien would have regarded chant as something that communicated a sense of the divine, an encounter with the great other. It may appear at first glance that there's nothing exotic in Shore's Shire themes. They do not come from borrowed non-Western material, and one may argue that these themes represent characters with which Western audiences identify. However, Irish and Celtic music is unique in that, to audiences across the world, it often represents an unrealized state of being, a home and community that we dream of and long for, but have not yet seen, something that somehow evaded us. Especially in America, where whole Irish communities fled during the Great Potato Famine, Irish traditional music has functioned as a symbol for lost love and a longing for a home far away. We see this cultural association in Hollywood's use of Irish music in films like Titanic, where the penny whistle, an instrument associated with Irish and Celtic folk music, carries the love theme at the film's tragic conclusion. Surprisingly, Irish music has a similar symbolic function in other cultures outside of the United States and Ireland. Ethnomusicologist Sean Williams wrote that during his stay in Japan, he was struck with the fact that not only most Japanese cities have at least one Irish pub or Irish music group, but also that many Japanese people feel a profound nostalgia when they hear Irish tunes, despite the fact they have never visited Ireland. In fact, many Japanese people that he interviewed said that Irish music made them think of home, childhood, or their mothers singing. Because of this worldwide identification with Irish music, Locke's exoticism binary of near versus far is inverted, where the other, or quote-unquote far away place or sensibility seems more home-like than the audience's present circumstances. Although it is possible to examine individual themes in Shore's soundtrack for elements of the exotic, Ralph P. Locke's broader definition of exoticism encompasses an entire musical work that's intended as a portrayal of a foreign place or way of being, whether the music sounds exotic to its audience or not. Thus, if Tolkien's view that the goal of all fantasy is to create a secondary world, the entire Lord of the Rings soundtrack as a work of fantasy, not merely its individual themes, should be considered exoticism because its purpose is to evoke a foreign place or way of being. The exotic nature of fantasy is evident from our earliest encounters with it. After all, the land where fairies have their being is usually introduced to us by fairy tales that begin with the formula, long ago in a land far away. From the first time we hear fairy tales as children to the time we enjoy epic fantasy as adults, we understand that the great appeal of fantasy is its exotic nature. Through it, we can reach beyond ourselves and the limits of our time and space to something that's new and exhilarating in its extremes of beauty and danger. Since its release in the early 2000s, Howard Shore's The Lord of the Rings soundtrack has gained both critical and popular acclaim. After winning several Academy Awards, the soundtrack was adapted to the Lord of the Rings Symphony, which is still touring and being performed in concert halls all over the world. Considering the overwhelming public reception of the Lord of the Rings soundtrack, composers and musical programmers of today should seriously consider the theories and aesthetic ideals that influence the writing and composing of the trilogy, first as a work of literature and then as music. Furthermore, discussions of musical exoticism must not be limited, as they often are, to topics such as Orientalism or cultural imperialism, but rather should include works of fantasy music, a genre to which exoticism is central. It may be that what modern audiences seek in a concert experience is not merely skilled musicianship, but the solace of escape and of transport.